everyone, and thank you all for joining Hudson Institute for this discussion with the veteran journalist Kai Strittmatter about his must-read book, We Have Been Harmonized, Life in China's Surveillance State. Kai Strittmatter has studied China for over 3 decades, and the book shows it. He first lived in China and Taiwan in the mid-1980s, and then later he worked in Beijing for many years as a correspondent for one of Germany's largest dailies, the Süddeutsche Zeitung. He is the author of several books on China, Hong Kong, as well as Istanbul, and most recently, We Have Been Harmonized, which is obligatory reading for all American policymakers and citizens alike. It is a clear-eyed, deeply researched and chilling portrait of the reality of a new China that until recently very few in Western nations recognized or in fact wanted to recognize. Among other things, Strittmatter looks closely at the emergence of digital Leninism inside the People's Republic of China and explains how China's ruling Communist Party has been harnessing big data, artificial intelligence, and other technologies to enhance its grip over the 1.4 billion people inside the PRC. And the book also looks at what this means for the world at large. Also joining us today is my colleague at Hudson, Nury Turkel, who is an adjunct fellow, a corporate lawyer, and a longtime Uyghur American civic leader. He is the chair of the indispensable Uyghur Human Rights Project, and in May of last year, he was appointed by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. Kai and Nury, thank you both for being here. And Kai, we'll begin with you. Not long ago, many China watchers were comfortable describing the PRC as post-totalitarian, but you make the compelling case in your book that China, the China of reform and opening up, is no longer, and that under Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party has been busy constructing a new kind of totalitarianism. We're keen to hear about your book, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Thanks for having me. Yes, actually, what you were saying, this is one of the main reasons why I really felt in 2016, in the end of 2016, felt compelled to write this book was that I saw that there were fundamental flaws in the perception of China, actually, and that China under Xi Jinping was becoming a totally new creature somehow. And that all this was happening whilst our own democracies, and I'm a European, our European Union, was actually descending really into a state of crisis. So, I mean, this is one of the big things that have changed during the last decades is that nowadays when we talk of China, it's no longer, we no longer only talk about China, we always talk about us at the same time. So I really felt I had something to say. And I started writing this book because of the changes that Xi Jinping was the new party chief starting from the end of 2012 was about to bring to China and had brought already in the year of 2016. And those were changes that were really amazing. I mean, when we all saw him taking over in Beijing in 2012, actually, none of us would have believed that China would change the way that it actually did in the end. We were all completely taken aback and taken by surprise. And I think that includes many people inside the Communist Party also. When I started doing my research and writing the book, I actually thought I would write a book about mechanisms of dictatorship, classical mechanisms of dictatorship in a way, like, you know, the things, instruments of power that autocrats all over the world and for many centuries and maybe even millennia have been using, like how are they dealing with language? What about the lying? You know, these things that we also see in our own society, actually, you know, with some of the right-wing populist movements, for example, and kidnapping of the words, collective amnesia, all these things that we've seen the Communist Party using for a long time. And the new thing with Xi Jinping actually was that he already back then in 2016 had set about creating a China that was completely different from the one that we grew up with, and the China that was still in our heads, the images of China we had, this China of reform and opening, which was created by Deng Xiaoping, and which was basically a China which was a stark contrast to the totalitarian state that Mao Zedong had left behind. And that was kind of a country and a party that had brought China to ruins. And Deng Xiaoping, in contrast to that, he actually decentralized power. He had a collective leadership. He actually set ideology aside and all these things, and he gave room for experiments for in the economy. But there were also niches of freedom. And when you just said that there were many people saying that China was a post-totalitarian country, I actually would underwrite that for most of the decades of reform and opening. China was not a totalitarian country anymore after Mao Zedong was dead. It was always a dictatorship. I mean, many people didn't even dare using that word anymore. They were like trying to, I don't know, authoritarian state, something like this, because we made good business with these people, and it sounds a little yucky, dictatorship. So many people didn't dare using that word anymore. I always called them a dictatorship, and rightfully so, because the Communist Party itself does so very proudly in its own constitution and in the constitution of the People's Republic as well. But it was no totalitarian state anymore. The party had ceded control in many parts of society. But suddenly, and we had all these, exciting developments going on, civil society springing up, all these amazing people, intellectuals, artists, but also business people coming up and having the freedom actually to do their thing for many years. Under certain restrictions, of course. And then comes Xi Jinping and does away with all of this. Suddenly, Xi Jinping is no Mao. This is one thing. He's not a new Mao. This is something we can read very often, but he's actually in many ways the opposite of Mao. Mao loved chaos. Mao was a rebel, the eternal rebel. Xi Jinping is the opposite. He's a freak, a control freak. He loves stability and control. But he uses some of the techniques of Mao, and what he has done is he has brought a level of repression back to China that we haven't seen since the days of Mao Zedong. So we're seeing repression again that we haven't seen for decades. We're seeing ideology coming back. It's both Marxism and a new brand of ideology named after Xi Jinping himself. Suddenly he's the big thinker, the big ideologist himself. We're seeing a re-centralization of power. We're seeing actually, it was a one-party state. Suddenly it's a one-man dictatorship again for the first time since the days of Mao as well. And as I said, when I set out writing this book, I wanted to tell the world first about this. And I thought in the end, by the end of 2016, I thought that would be it. That would be what I would be writing. I would be writing a book about classical mechanisms of dictatorship and the return of autocracy to Beijing and to China. And then very soon, something very interesting happened. And that was, I would say, by the end of 2016, beginning of 2017 mainly, we suddenly had the State Council coming out with a plan for its plan for artificial intelligence strategy, and suddenly proclaiming that China was going to catch up with the leading technology powers of the world, meaning the United States, of course, by 2025, and actually overtaking them and being number one in the world by 2030. And it wasn't only a plan, because at the same time, what you saw was there was an explosion of activity. Suddenly it was raining money, suddenly into artificial intelligence, big data, applications, and companies like this. These companies, these startups were coming out. They were springing up like mushrooms in the spring rain. Really incredible. And suddenly, this was everything everybody was talking about all the time was artificial intelligence and big data. And suddenly, we had a second leg to this policy of Xi Jinping. The first leg was basically reinstalling old style, 1950s repression and ideology. And that's basically going back in time. But suddenly we're seeing him with his other foot. He's going right into the 21st century. And what he's trying to do is actually what you were just calling the digital Leninism. He's actually trying to give dictatorship a digital update. He's trying to reinvent dictatorship with the means of information technology and artificial intelligence of the 21st century. And that was done in such an astonishing determination and speed, and with resources and money. I would say there's been no other government on the planet that has thrown itself into this field of artificial intelligence, big data, like the Chinese has. Certainly not the American. In the United States, it's private companies that do this mainly. It's Silicon Valley. We all know this. In China, all these efforts are led by the states, but of course, many of the new actors are private companies as well, even though probably most of us know a private company in China is not exactly the same thing as it is in the West, because they're all forced to cooperate to the fullest extent with the Communist Party. So suddenly, for my last 2 years in China, I left China by the end of 2018. I found myself researching basically nothing else than this. I went to see all these companies, startups, artificial intelligence startups, a lot of those facial recognition companies that also have made headlines in the West, voice recognition and all this. And of course, one part of their reasoning is always, the Communist Party would say, we missed the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. This is why we were humiliated by the West for 150 years after. This is not going to happen again. We're going to be number one in this new revolution now. So there's a strong economic incentive also. There's always a strong economic part to all those politics. But at the same time, there's the surveillance part. And I mean, in a way, it is amazing, isn't it? Because we've been told, we've been growing up in America and in Europe with all these tech prophets telling us again and again with every new technology that this is going to bring freedom to the world. It's going to undermine and subvert authoritarian regimes. We were being told that with satellite TV. We were being told that with mobile phones, and then with the internet people like Bill Clinton, that you can't control the internet. It's like nailing Jello to the wall. But here they were, the Chinese Communist Party, and they had done it perfectly well. It's amazing. And with the internet, I watched it myself. I started working as a journalist in 1997 there, the Chinese maybe were the first authoritarian regime to prove actually that they needn't fear any of these technologies, but on the opposite, they love them. They love the internet. They've grown to love the internet, and they seem to love artificial intelligence and big data applications now, because they have realized if you have the resources, if you have the determination and the right balance of propaganda, censorship, brainwashing, and economic incentives, actually it works to your favor. And it not only does it work to your favor, but it actually it can perfect your rule, And Xi Jinping, with these new technologies, is actually trying to maybe be the first ruler to make the eternal dream of all autocratic rulers come true, the complete and utter total control of each and every citizen. So I said at one point that Xi Jinping is no Mao Zedong, but there's one quote of Mao that he uses again and again, and this is the one where Mao once said, doesn't matter whether it's the East or the West, whether it's the South or the North or the center, the party has to control everything. So total control of the party is coming back. Xi Jinping is trying to bring it back, and he's trying to use these new technologies in doing that. Maybe 2 points. I mean, there's many examples I could give for that, but I won't go into the details now. two points that are very important in this is when you have these new technologies, what's actually happening there in China on the ground. I mean, they've come very far already with these, for example, facial recognition networks of surveillance cameras. They call it the Skynet. What's happening is that there is a sort of internalization of control is taking place. What they're trying to do with these new technologies is, you know, I said they're bringing totalitarianism back in digital guise, actually, but it's going to be a much smarter totalitarianism than the old one. The old totalitarianism of Stalin and of Mao had to rely really on everyday terror. And, you know, you would go to bed shivering with fear, probably under Mao and under Stalin, and you would wake up being fearful of the terror that might descend onto your home and family. This is very different nowadays, these days. You know, what they're trying to do is actually, you know, implant self-censorship into the head of every single citizen, and actually make everyone their own policeman, because then you don't need the policeman in front, you know, at the street corner anymore, if everybody is actually its own policeman. And that works if everybody has the impression that there is this all-knowing, all-powerful I that sees everything that you do, you know, and it doesn't have to look right at this moment. You know, the People's Daily at one point in 2018 already said our Skynet, our network of surveillance camera, is actually already capable of identifying each and every single one of our 1.4 billion citizens in the course of 1 second. That sounds quite scary, but you might ask yourself, is that even true? You know, and back in 2018, I would have said, I don't even believe that that's true, or that that was true at that moment, but that's not the point. The point is not, is that true? The point is, do people believe it's true? The belief is enough, you know, it's enough that you believe that you could be watched every second to make you change your behavior. So internalization of control is one thing, and another thing is predictive policing. And already in 2017, and this is where we come to Xinjiang also, because, you know, already in 2017, there was a minister in Beijing, the vice minister for technology, a guy called Li Men, who said in 2017 already, artificial intelligence is brilliant. It will help our party in so many ways. And the best way is already today, it can help us to know who is going to be a terrorist in the future. You know, this is what he said. And I might add in my own words, even if the guy himself doesn't even know it, even if you know, Eric or me, we might be the potential terrorists in the future. We don't even know it ourselves, but the all-knowing, all-seeing party already knows it. And this is when they act. And nowadays, in hindsight, it makes completely sense. Why did that guy say that in 2017? Of course, that was when all the AI hype started in China. But in 2019, we suddenly discovered that was also when they started building the camp system, this new gulag in Xinjiang for the Uyghurs, for the Muslim minority in Xinjiang. This huge camp system of re-education camps, which have been also refitted, some of them as labor camps later, where probably more than 1 million people have disappeared. 1 million out of 10 or 11 million, I might say, so 10% of the Uyghur population. It's really amazing. And it makes completely sense, because what we see in Xinjiang is actually, the prime example. It's the laboratory for many of Xi Jinping's policies of repression, but also for the artificial intelligence and high-tech sort of repression and surveillance that we're seeing also in the rest of China, but nowhere as extreme and as fast. You know, the new technologies come all to Xinjiang first. Xinjiang is the huge high-tech laboratory for surveillance for the Communist Party in China. And all these people ending up in the re-education camps in Xinjiang are citizens, Uyghur and Kazakh citizens, Muslims, nearly all of them, that ended up not because they were caught doing something, not because they were being charged in the judicial system with anything. They have never seen a judge, they have never seen a lawyer, but all of them because they ended up in the system that had been collecting information, all these kinds of informations, and lots of this with big data applications, and the surveillance cameras are part of it, but it's much more. There is a huge platform, a big data platform in Xinjiang, which is called the Integrated Platform for Joint Operation. This is the platform that the police uses, and everything you do, your whole life basically goes in there. And I mean, of course, the obvious things, they're looking for people who are religious, but your birth control methods, your online shopping, your online comments, your GPS data, wherever you were, who you've been together with, but also, as we have seen from some internal government files that were actually leaked to the Western press last year, what are the kind of things that make you suspicious in a system like this? They actually listed things like he doesn't speak to his neighbors a lot. He doesn't use the front door as much as the back door. Things like these can make you end up in a labor camp in the end, or in a re-education camp. So Xinjiang is probably really the extreme and prime example of where all this is playing out, and it's playing out in a quite scary way. And I see I've already spoken too long. Very sorry. I just stop here and wait for your questions.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Kai. Before I turn to Nury, let me ask you a quick question, Kai. Your book frequently alludes to Western dystopian literature, George Orwell, Aldous Huxley, amongst others. And I know that you've thought a lot about that tradition and that critique. Yet there's a paradox in part of what you try to describe, and what you do describe very eloquently in your book, that people seem to want this surveillance, not just the party state, but ordinary people in some parts of China. I ask this, I bring this up because now in Washington and in other parts of Western countries today, there's some discussion about this being part of Chinese cultural norms, cultural values, which are foreign and different from our own. But you counter that in your book, and I wanted to ask you to put to speak as a sinologist and talk a little bit about Chinese cultural traditions and what they say about the buildup of this surveillance state.
Because there's many things to say to this. First of all, probably, China is not a traditional Orwellian surveillance state. Orwell is probably he does describe a lot of the mechanisms that are going on there. Incredible how far-sighted he was. And I reread him actually for my book. But that's only half of what you see in China. The other half is actually a society that has thrown itself also into consumption and commerce, and like no other on the planet except the American one, I would say. And that was part of the deal that the party made with the Chinese urban elite, especially after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. It's like, okay, from now on, you shut up. You're not going to be active politically anymore, but you can make money, you can make profit, and you can consume. And this is what's going on. So this is why when you come to China, you don't find a sort of, like the old Soviet Union, but it's colorful, it's lively, it's exciting, because consumption is actually something that is wanted and that is allowed. And this is sort of the Aldous Huxley part. This is the Brave New World part of the whole thing. The other thing you're talking about, that's very important, because this is an argument the Chinese Communist Party itself always makes. It's an Orientalism invented by the Communist Party, actually. We're so different. The Chinese people are so different. First of all, they don't have democracy in their DNA, and they're so, they're not individualists. They're much more willing to sacrifice for the collective, and our values are so different. You can't really you can't really judge us. Also, our style of government is very, very, very different. You can't really understand what we're doing here because you're not Chinese and because you really don't understand. And I would say this is most of it is just nonsense. It's really this kind of Orientalism by the party. If you want to understand how the Communist Party rules, you don't need to read Confucius and you don't need to read Lao Tzu. You don't need to be a sinologist at all. What you need to read is actually Marx and Lenin and your Mao. Those are the things that would actually explain the mechanisms of Chinese Communist Party rule very, very well. And so this is one thing. And when you speak about the people, of course, it's true that there hasn't been a tradition of discussion about surveillance and about privacy and data protection issues. But why is that? Of course, because all kind of discussions are censored and the flow of information is actually controlled very well. So the interesting part is when you look at China and you see sometimes when there are cracks in the wall, you know, and suddenly you see the Chinese people behaving in a way that's really surprising because it's not at all the way the party has told us the Chinese people would be or would behave. On the contrary, they're behaving just like us. They're complaining about surveillance. They're complaining about their lack of privacy and data protection. And you can see that sometimes in the Chinese internet, for example, there has been some discussions of too much surveillance and artificial intelligence intrusion into the private lives of citizens. As long as private companies and private enterprise is concerned, you know, then these discussions actually are allowed and people are allowed to complain about private companies, actually like the internet companies, the Chinese internet companies intruding into their lives. And there have been fascinating discussions. And then you suddenly see, well, wow, you know, they're just behaving just like we do. It's exactly the same. But we shouldn't actually really be surprised because let's just look at Hong Kong, let's look at Taiwan. Same DNA, same black hair, same black eyes, same tradition. Actually, the only places of Chinese territory where Chinese tradition was never violently destroyed, like in the People's Republic. And you look at these places, they're mind-blowing because these are the places where you can actually see Chinese people. How do Chinese people actually behave when they have not grown up under the government of the Communist Party of China? And suddenly you see in Hong Kong, you see them going out in the millions on the street, fighting for freedom and democracy. And in Taiwan, you see an even better example because Taiwan is a full-blown democracy. And I would argue it's the most dynamic and fascinating democracy in East Asia. It's a more dynamic democracy than the Japanese one or the South Korean one, even I would argue. So this argument, I'm a sinologist, you know, and I know sinologists also love to make these arguments because probably it saves their jobs, you know, because then they can be the gatekeepers to explain the Chinese people. But as I said, you know, I love to actually emphasize the fact that the Chinese people are much more like us, like we think. And actually, one of the most exciting recent examples has been the very short-lived existence of the new Clubhouse app in China. I don't know whether you followed this, you know, this audio app where people can have discussions, live discussions with each other. And the Chinese Communist Party actually was very late to the party for like about 1 week or something. They didn't realize that there was a thing like this. And you had thousands of people. There's a limit of 5,000 people to one discussions discussing matters like Tiananmen massacre, Taiwan and Xinjiang. And suddenly you had Chinese people from Beijing, from Shanghai, together with Uyghur people, together with Hong Kongers in these chat rooms having civilized discussions and actually showing understanding for each other. Fascinating.
Thank you, Kai. Yeah, I was reminded recently, Tsai Xia, who used to be a professor at the party school in Beijing and is now in the United States, she remarked recently that 60 to 70% of the people in the Chinese Communist Party know that what Xi Jinping is doing is wrong. And that's something that we should all keep in mind, I think. Thank you very much, Kai. I'm going to hand things over to Nury. Nury, a friend of mine, was actually born in a political re-education camp in Xinjiang, which is one example of how a lot of the new PRC is in fact pretty old in some respects. So Nury, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be able to join you, Eric. This is my first public event since I joined Hudson. Kay, thank you so much for your excellent book, excellent presentation, helping us and the entire world to better understand Chinese digital authoritarianism. And now people should start thinking about, why this is related to us. It's about total control, as you eloquently described in your book. For decades, so also this is something that you mentioned and discussed in your book, that the international community commonly believed that capitalism, helping China to become a technologically advanced country, will make them to just become one of us. Obviously, that didn't happen. Instead, they're using that technology for domestic repression and the influence operations around the world. You mentioned the 2017. I think that is a critical turning point, very important year for the Uyghur people for two reasons. One, the party secretary Chen Changguo, who was previously in Tibet, promoted and given legal authority, tools, resources, in early 2017, with the enactment of something called the de-extremification measure, enacted April 1, 2017. And then the same year, the AI supported mass arrest really ramped up. Initially, the de-extremification measure laid a political, legal groundwork or justification for the local authority to collect massive data that includes blood samples, iris scans, sound sample, voice samples. And also, interestingly, around that time, in the previous year, they also encouraged the Uyghurs to show up for free health checkup. And also, they encouraged the Uyghurs to apply for passports. With the passport application, they collected personal data, biometrics, and also with the free health checkup, they also collected DNA samples. So in 2017, based on the China cable that you're referencing earlier, the leaked documents, the IJOP, Integrated Joint Operating Platform, created a list of 20,000 people in 10 days in summer 2017. And the police did not have 20,000 people identified to be arrested. They initially identified about 16,000, and then under pressure, they increased the number, barely met the quota. And in that 10 days, as you pointed out earlier, they're all about rounding up people with the support of this massive database that they built. And most of the people did not even know why they were picked up. So the concept of concentration camp that has been used, I think, is the right one. Because, again, as you pointed out, this is all extrajudicial. They have no access to lawyers, no access to court. There will be never formal charges against them as long as they kept in the concentration camp and the forced labor camps. And Secretary Pompeo, when making this determination, who is now with Hudson, said something very interesting, that this ongoing genocide is a very unique genocide. I think he's referring to the technological aspect of the ongoing genocide in Xi Jinping's China. So the forced labor, and you're right in saying that this has been a laboratory. Some people think that the technology initially were used in inland China, tested out, it worked, and it was effective. And then they exported to the Uyghur region and expanded it by using the local population as a kind of a laboratory material. I think the international community need to look at two things. One, since this is China's geopolitical and part of China's geopolitical or global ambition, the international community, including those in Europe who are skeptical, should think about how it is going to damage their own national security. They can just ignore the United States' encouragement to look into this seriously. And two, this will eventually be a threat to democracy, civil liberties, privacy. So this is no longer just about the Chinese citizens, the Tibetan people, the Uyghur people. This is about us. This is going to affect everybody's life. The commission that I'm serving as a commissioner, USERF, hold a hearing last year. One of our witnesses told us that there are more than 80 countries have adopted the Chinese surveillance techniques. In 2019, based on the New York Times report on a similar subject, I used the number of 36 in my speech at the Oslo Freedom Forum. From summer 2019, little over a year, that number has dramatically increased to over 80 countries. That should give a pause to anyone who's trying to normalize their relationship, normalize the China's expansion of digital authoritarianism around the world. So this is about us now. We need to formulate a policy, a clear policy. We need to put in place additional legal tools. We need to also look into law enforcement aspect, because the China is using the very same tool, even threatening our sovereignty here in the United States, and also threatening the well-beings of the Americans living in this country. I wanted to thank you for your excellent book again. I learned so much. I've been immersed in these issues in the last 3-4 years. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nury. Nury, before I go back to Mr. Strittmatter, a quick question for you. As you know, about 1.5 years ago, one of our friends, Rushan Abbas, spoke on a panel at Hudson Institute about the deteriorating situation in Xinjiang. Approximately 5 days later, her elder sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, was disappeared by PRC authorities, and she remains, as far as we know, detained in a PRC detention center to this day. The US government is clearly very concerned about PRC's long-arm efforts to intimidate and to harass and to silence many Americans and others here in the United States that are advocating for human rights in China and elsewhere. What is your view about the next phase of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, the important legislation that seeks to protect Americans from these long-arm tactics? And what is your concern about PRC's use in particular of cyber and technological means to influence the discussion here in the United States?
The Chinese harassment of the Uyghur community is nothing new to those of us who've been dealing with this for a long time. Initially, they used the spyware, spam, to get access to the computers. But starting 2017, the Uyghur diaspora around the world experienced something so strange, which was the family members telling them, "Don't contact me. I'm going to delete you right now." So even on the WeChat, that is like 100% monitored by the Chinese government, was not something that the Uyghur families were comfortable enough to use to maintain kind of, allowing the cyber police to monitor in and out communication, because it was dangerous. The Chinese forced the Uyghur residents on the ground to install this mandatory spyware on their phone to monitor every single communications. And also, if they find something objectionable, like the pictures of their foreign family members, could land them in a concentration camp. So the Uyghur families made a conscious decision to disconnect or delete their foreign-based loved ones, children, relatives. That had created enormous anxiety. A case followed German citizen Dolkun Asa, for example, found out about his mother's death in the concentration camp through the Radio Free Asia reporting. And here in the United States, we live in a free country. The Chinese threaten the Uyghur residents here who either spoke out, or inclined to speak out, or not saying anything by with very specific threat saying, okay, if you speak out like the way that Rushan did, there will be consequences. We'll take care of you. And in the other case, there are some Uyghurs in the United States, even today, have not been public because they worry the additional family members will be taken to the concentration camps. And then the third type, through the WeChat, the Chinese officials, Chinese security officials threaten the American US-based activist Uyghur residents saying, you have to work for us. You have to work for us as an informant to monitor. So the UHRP Act has a specific provision that directs the FBI, our law enforcement, to look into this along with NDI, DNI, to investigate and report to the Congress the things that the measurements that have been implemented. It's been a little over 6 months since the law's been enacted. We would like to see a specific actions been taken by the United States to protect the Uyghur American community. I think this is the same model that the others could use in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Canada, in UK, in Australia. Actually, the United States is far better ahead of the curve in protecting the Uyghur Americans. There are thousands of Uyghurs living in Europe, cannot even go to talk to their governments, fearful of the government, A, may not believe in them, and two, if they communicate with the government, Chinese find out and there will be consequences. It's a nightmare. It's a dystopian situation. So in order to address this, the government and the industry should work together. The Silicon Valley has a huge responsibility. It's so wrong. Secretary Blinken said in his confirmation hearing that he will work to prevent US companies aiding, abetting, or assisting the ongoing genocidal campaign in response to the question as to what he will do in the next 30 days. So societally, governmentally, and in the business community, we have to tackle this problem seriously because our sovereignty is under attack.
Thank you, Nury. Kai, we're running out of time, so I have one final question for you, and I wish we could spend the rest of the afternoon with you, but here it goes. Your book, among many other things, contains a very powerful indictment of democratic complacency and in some cases even complicity in the buildup of the PRC surveillance state, which now, and I believe you agree, as Nury had said, represents probably the greatest threat to democratic life that we've seen for decades. What do you believe should be the core principles and codes of conduct that democracies in Asia and in Europe and in North America should work toward in preventing and ensuring that they're not complicit in the future buildup of this of the PRC surveillance state and this new form of technological totalitarianism?
Yeah, thanks for the question. This is the other new thing, isn't it? It's not only the new high-tech surveillance state that's coming up, but it's for the first time in many decades, we have a China that is increasingly active and proactive, very self-assured, sometimes arrogant, sometimes aggressive in the international arena after being really passive actually for decades. And I mean, there's been a time, you probably remember that, Eric, when our politicians were actually encouraging Beijing to, become more engaged in different aspects of world politics, be it during the financial crisis in the Middle East, wherever, be a stabilizing force. because they had become more and more an economic power and a bigger and bigger economic power. And China always said, no, 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 we don't want to. We want to just focus on ourselves. And that has changed completely. Also in 2017, actually, there was this speech by Xi Jinping where he came out and said, we're marching now to the center of the world, and we're bringing the China wisdom to the world, 中国智慧, the China wisdom. And of course, again, he's not talking about Confucius and Lao Tzu and Feng Shui, he's talking about Leninist norms and values of Leninist dictatorships. So your question, I would say, is actually two parts. One is the complicity with what's going on in China. That's the very concrete part, I think, where it's probably easier to take actions, because we know names of companies that have had partnerships. And Nury was speaking about the DNA collection. Again, there was the New York Times that had an investigation and found out that it was an American company actually providing the technology for the DNA sampling in Xinjiang and all these things. And Donald Trump, one of the things that we might credit him with is actually that he started these lists of companies and individuals which are going to be sanctioned. As Nury said, Europe is way behind on that. We have this debate in Germany now. I mean, that's already a big step for us, having a debate. 2 years ago, we didn't even have the debate, and probably in Washington, it was the same thing. Suddenly, everyone's woken up. So that's one big step already. Europe is way behind on that. We have Volkswagen, the big German car maker, who has still a big factory in Xinjiang, and is really, when you listen to their statements, to their public statements, they really make you cringe. But that's our job, to really keep them, they have to defend themselves. We have to hold them responsible. Actually, we have to hold our politicians responsible. But when you say, in the end, I would argue, I mean, one of the big things that we have to be really careful, we have to define our red lines. Here are our red lines. This is what cannot happen. This is what cannot happen with our companies when they go to China, but also those are the things that can't happen on our own territory. And so Chinese foreign influence, these influence operations, that's another thing. That's another big thing. And I would say, and they're one piece of the puzzle. You have the Russians, you have the Chinese, you have other subverting influences for our democracy. I would say we really, as democracies, we really have to find new enthusiasm and passion. And if, speaking to an American now and speaking to the America, looking from the outside, looking from Europe, actually, when the Chinese propaganda was pointing to Great Britain, Brexit, and to the United States, Donald Trump, and everything what was happening with the coronavirus and all this, pointing to the United States and saying, see, this is a good example for the decline of democracies. Actually, you would have found many Europeans agreeing with them. And I would say this is one of the big problems that we're having all over the West, in America, but also in outside. We have to rekindle the passion for democracy. We have to rebuild democracy again, really. If they are reinventing dictatorship, we have to reinvent democracy at the same time with us. And I would still say, China, you might call it, a challenge, one of the biggest challenge, the biggest challenge that we're facing in the 21st century. You might call it a threat. I would still argue, in the end, if you look at all the threats that are around, do we actually have to fear China? I would say, in the end, if we have to fear someone, it's us, actually, ourselves. We are still in the better positions. We still have the better system. But there are so many dangers. We are sabotaging ourselves now. This is the problem. If we find ourselves, if we can reinvent democracy, I have no doubt at all that we can deal with the challenge that China is actually presenting to us.
Thank you very much, Kai, for all of your clarity and for being with us today. And thank you as well to Nury Turkel. Kai, we hope to have you back. And thank you again for your very important book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.